Here was our first publication from Reuters Institute, which does quite a bit of work on the research side with case studies, publications, articles. And this particular report was designed to take a look at the global trade compliance, global trade industry.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're in for another show. I keep saying that, but we keep doing so many of these shows for SimplyTrade podcast, and we've got a good show in that's going to be rich in content today. But Lalo, I will say to save time, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guests as we get into talking about a very detailed report that's got a lot of information on it.
Sure. So I have somewhat of a connection with Thomson Reuters only because they acquired a company that I used to work for, and one of our guests here today, Karen, and I were onboarded at the exact same time with that previous company with Integration Point. We were onboarded to. I think we were both desk mates or something like that when we went through this week and a half of onboarding and training and just everything. But her and I came on together, and that's how I know Karen. And then Andrew, I'm pretty sure I've actually talked to him even before it was Thomson Reuters, back in the Boskage days. I mean,
back in the Boskage days.
Yeah, imagine that. Gosh, that's crazy, right, Andrew? So anyway, we'll talk to, we have a couple of people here from Thomson Reuters, and that's Karen Lobdell and Andrew Moxon. Y'all, maybe if anybody, have you been to any of the conferences like AEI, ICPA, et cetera? You may have run into them. They've been at the booths, and in Karen's case, she's actually been a speaker several times, I think with AEI, in fact. But anyway, but we'll have them speak a little bit more about that. But we're talking to them about an annual report that Thomson Reuters puts out, and they normally put it out annually. Pretty comprehensive, talking about just about everything. Again, we'll let them talk about that. But Karen and Andrew, thank you for joining us here on our podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So the report that we're talking about, Thomson Reuters Institute has published a report. It's the 2023 Corporate Global Trade Survey Report. And the subtitle on it, Expanding Roles for Trade Compliance Jobs and Technology. This is a report that you need to make sure you reach out and get and talk about. And in looking at it, let me just say right now, first off, both Karen and Andrew, thank you so much for joining our show. Karen, you and I obviously have known each other for a while and have seen each other and tag team at different conferences, which has always been a pleasure. And definitely, I've always been a big proponent of the Boskage days and keeping my staff informed and shall we say, equipped with the right different books and resources. So. But with that, Karen, how is this report being published? Is it just digitally? Is it by email? Is it by your hard copy? What do we got first off?
It's available online, so it's digitally produced by Thomson Reuters Institute. You can simply go to the Thomson Reuters website, to the pages for Thomson Reuters Institute, and you can download it from there. That's the easiest way to get your hands on a copy. It's available for anyone. There's no cost to it, and certainly easy to get to. That's the easiest way. Everything's digital these days.
I was going to say, Karen, the easiest way, just go down to our show notes and you just click the link. I'm going to put it on there.
Well, with that is that, what is the whole objective here of this? What are you trying to look at as you're looking at this different information? It looks like there was a lot of survey information that came through. So how did this come about?
This is the second year of publication. So last year was our first publication from Reuters Institute, which does quite a bit of work on the research side with case studies, publications, articles. And this particular report was designed to take a look at the global trade compliance, global trade industry, and really get a sense from the respondents, which, there were, I think, 177 respondents to this survey. It's an online survey that has open text questions. It takes them roughly 15 or 20 minutes to complete it. And it focuses on a variety of topics. So it's looking at trade challenges for the global trade professionals, talent issues with regards to talent and skill requirements in these roles. Technology, of course, is a big topic to look at how technology is being used in this particular arena. And more recently, with this year's report, they added in the topic of ESG and how that is folding into global trade professional responsibilities and the impact there as well. But it's really providing an overall sense of what the market looks like for companies operating in this space, what their priorities are, where they're focusing their strategies in the coming year, what issues they're most challenged by, and where they're investing both in talent and technology.
All right. And when you're talking about ESG, you're talking along the lines of environmental type things, correct?
Everything in the spectrum. So environmental, social, governance, and clearly with respect to global trade management, global trade compliance, that falls in a lot of those buckets. Everything from, high profile forced labor under the social, environmental concerns under things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms or deforestation, and then governance, which clearly is just compliance as a whole, but people traditionally in the trade compliance space may look at it more in the areas of things such as Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a good example of that. But yeah, the full spectrum.
Andrew, let me ask you a question. Is that in this, as we're going through, who should be the focus in reading this? Who in what levels or whatever should look at really getting a hold of it? It's a 29-page report, including cover and cover. So, but who should read this thing?
Well, I would naturally say that anybody involved in global trade compliance would benefit from reading this, whether it be from, the top down and you're talking about, somebody in the C-suite who wants to understand what the overall trends are to help guide strategy and sort of navigate the way forward in the current environment, to somebody who's just joined, with an organization's trade compliance department and is in a center of excellence, helping to classify, or is working with a broker or anybody who would like to understand the organization, the industry that they've become a part of. There's really a depth, and I think Lalo mentioned at the beginning of this, a depth of detailed information, but also larger trends that I think would be useful for anybody to open up and take a look through.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting is early in the report is talking about, and I'll just mention it here, strategic priorities for global trade and supply chain management. So in other words, what seems to be impacting or is a key variable as I'm trying to manage my supply chain and do some planning and whatnot. And top 5, it gives the top 10, but the top 5 issues: inflation, rising cost of goods and transportation. That's a big deal. See that's the number 1. Number 2, supply chain shortages and disruption. So the supply chain disruption, things like, for example, a volcano erupting and it's diverting things. The Houthis attacking in the Red Sea, attacking ships in the Middle East, and that's a disruption. And that's primarily affecting, European destined goods, but then there are vessels out of position, and that's negatively affecting then U.S. and other parts of the world. International politics or geopolitical issues and the conflicts there, like U.S. and China, China and Taiwan, obviously Russia and Ukraine, all those kinds of different things. Availability and demand of items is the fourth one. And that's been a key thing is availability is people being able to get the goods because they can't be manufactured in a timely basis because the raw goods can't seem to get there or whatever components. Trade tariff compliance. That's another one that seems to be interesting. I want to hear that one. That's the fifth item, and it can go on from there. But as we were looking at that, there's some side things that come into play here, like you just mentioned, Karen, with the environmental, social, and governance. I guess as a whole, how much of all of that seems to be affected by at least the environmental side and the green initiatives that seem to be getting pushed out all over the world?
I think that the environmental piece is probably a newer challenge that's being thrown into the mix as compared to some of the other ESG, social and governance items, which, people have been struggling with for, a few years now. I mean, forced labor is really not new. That's been going on for some time now. But when we look at environmental, I think that's something that in the global trade management space is a newer challenge, because as we get these regulations like CBAM with the EU and deforestation, it's pulling in those cross-border moves. It's not just a domestic national issue. It's now touching on those cross-border moves, and it's being attached to those transactions and those entries or declarations. And as a result, global trade is having to take a look at those areas, and some of them are pretty complex. They're fee or tax focused. There's trading schemes for them. Capturing the information that's required from a reporting standpoint is challenging, and that probably goes to one of those other areas that as a whole within global trade has become a bigger issue, and that's your supply chain visibility down to the nth tier, having that line of communication with your business partners where you're able to actually get to that information. The green trade with customs, I think, is, one of those things that's newer as well. And it's yet to play out, I think, on exactly the type of impact that's going to have. I think companies are looking for how can we do the right thing, how we can comply with regulations, but at the same time, how can we do the right thing to support positive environmental concerns? There are limited standards in this area right now when you look at carbon emissions for measurements, for reporting, and that adds to the challenges. You've got all these various laws coming up the pipeline, and they're not all being approached, measured, or required to follow the same pattern. So when you're in global trade and you're a global trade professional trying to track all this and comply with laws in multiple countries, and they're all doing it differently, it makes for a pretty big challenge. And I think emissions is one of the ones we're noticing with a lot of our clients and trade professionals that we talk to is a tough one to get their hands around. And a lot of people are still not really sure how to approach it.
Well, one of the things I see in this particular report is it would be a great one as a resource to look at and identify particular areas where companies should, I guess, utilize their regulatory and industry affairs type activities to say, look, just to your point, there have been different committees it's like, we want zero emissions. Quite frankly, I think that's a panacea personally, idea, but then, we'll have a carbon offset or whatever. You can do whatever. But the point being is in these different countries and regions is your report shows some areas that, you need to get involved with things. And this would be a good, I guess, justification to get yourself proficient so that you can get involved, because a lot of these governments are putting together a group that seems to come up with, okay, here's what the emissions allowable standards will be. And they're not, you go from country to country, they're all different, or region to region. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of continuity between all of that. Would that be a fair assessment to say, in looking at it, I need to get involved as a company to avoid some major problems in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think we all probably on this call recognize the fact that advocating for reasonable regulatory approaches to some of these issues is critical for companies, and you have to have a voice in that. If you just wait for the government or agencies to create them without input, you're going to get what you get, and you have to live with it. So advocacy is critical, and there's lots of channels to do that through, depending on where you're located, whether that's through associations like ICPA or AAEI or RELA or some of these, industry associations. And I'm just mentioning U.S. ones, but clearly there's other avenues outside the U.S. as well. I think that's very important. And you're right. It differs from country to country with regards to that. But having a voice in it is important. At a minimum, it's something that has to be in your scope of what you're paying attention to from a regulatory standpoint. You have to be aware, you have to read the regulations, you have to understand what's going to be involved and what that impact is going to be in the global trade space to the movement of your goods, the cost of your goods, your bottom line, and the impact to your company, whether that's a cost or a reputational issue.
Because of those reasons, it's not just a need to do it, but there's a strong desire to do it that we're seeing in the report as well. So, almost 80% of large companies stated that those considerations were an important factor when they were deciding when to use a supplier. And if you look at what is driving that, in some geographies, there's an interest in saving money as the top priority, but there's also really a desire to be in compliance, despite these varying levels of requirement and the difficulties in navigating all that and understanding what might be needed there. And in North American companies, the top reason reported was actually to align with corporate values. So we definitely see a lot of engagement, a lot of leaning in on behalf of the trade to make sure they're compliant, even if it is confusing sometimes as to how.
And Karen and Andrew, when I read through the report, I it's so much in there, but things kept on popping up it's very surprising. Like, what in the report do you feel was the biggest surprise, I guess, or what were the biggest surprises of the report that you found that the respondents said about, and any of the questions that they had?
That's a tough one. I think for me, one of the surprises was in looking at the technology and how people are using technology. It didn't surprise me so much that there's an increase in use. I think that's good. And I think that's, something that's, people have recognized you can't stay compliant in a global economy like it is today with the complexities of regulations without having tools. So that wasn't so surprising, but it was kind of surprising to see like which pieces of technology people were spending time on. And I think, we mentioned once before that the global classification type technology is, used by a relatively small percent of respondents, which to me was interesting because I always viewed that as like a baseline. When you start implementing technology for global trade management, that seemed like that was usually the starting point. And that's been my experience in working with companies, is that was one of the core things they always started with. So that to me was a surprise as to kind of where the focus on technology was being placed. Andrew, you may have seen some other things as well from your perspective that you found surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would reiterate, the things that you said, but I would also say that looking at what particularly in the regulatory landscape had gained and where it had fallen. I was a bit surprised. I wasn't surprised to see that residency issues around China had risen, but we did see a significant drop off in Russia sanctions as being a driving factor from 2022 to 23. Even though they are very much in the news and sort of front of mind, and we still hear our customers talking about them a lot. So I found that one to be, I guess, a bit surprising. I don't know, Karen, if you have a view on what that trend might indicate. I did find it curious.
I was a little bit surprised by it, although I do think that there has been so much focus on those sanctions over the past year or so that, since the initiation of the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, that, companies have really been forced to put things in place to help comply with those sanctions. So I think people have stabilized their approach a bit, and there are some really excellent tools out there to assist them in screening and monitoring. And those tools, there's lots of options for that out there. Let's put it that way. So it's not a hard area to put something in place to attempt to comply. Now, that being said, it'll be interesting to see how next year's report looks, because as we know, in the last 24 hours, we've seen a huge plethora of additional sanctions come out from the UK and the EU, and the US this morning had another 500 entities put on the sanctions list. And we're also seeing where it's not just the sanctions themselves and screening is this entity on a list, but we're now seeing obviously the focus on being more astute in how you investigate that further, meaning we know that circumvention takes place. We know that diversion takes place. We know that the government has put resources and appropriations and funding toward going after bad actors in those spaces. So it's not just, am I selling or shipping to this party? It's now, you better know all the tangents off your supply chain, the ownership side of it, and really pay attention. If you're shipping to Turkey, that's a high risk for diversion on Russian sanction items. So that complexity is now coming back in, and it'll be interesting to see what next year's report looks like, and if it maintains that it's not as high a priority or if it upticks again.
Well, one of the things I was seeing in your report, you talk about there appears to be, the talent and skills gap, in that, there's still an issue with trying to find people to do the jobs or get them trained and become proficient. And in dealing with it, your report talks about how people are introducing technology to cover some things. That was a big one that you just mentioned on it, but, and then have plans to, actively introduce, different efficiencies, trying to make things more productive. Well, in the overall scope of things, I guess, classification is one of those that, classifying of goods, if you will, with the harmless tariff is one of those that comes into play. I'm shocked to see that as your respondents, as you were just saying, that only 6% said that they are using, some software or some online type deal to do their classification. That seems to be a big opportunity as more AI type capability systems come out to do classification and take over some of those things. I've been hearing things where more and more of in the compliance area specifically, people are retiring, and there has not been a influx of folks to backfill some of these positions. Companies are struggling with that. So with this, do you see that as being an issue here where I guess there's some good opportunity for software companies, but also as a company, is that an area to look at to really engage in, or should you just continue to look at using consultants or a third party to do your classification?
Well, I think we might be accused of having a vested interest in the answer here, but I think that I really like the way that you framed it, because it is an opportunity, obviously, for software companies to have conversations with people in the trade about how we can help manage the risk and how we can help identify the opportunity. But the truth is that companies that invest in modernizing their global trade technology are going to have a competitive advantage. And it's simple to say why, because if you're more efficient and you're more automated, then you can spend more of the increasingly valuable time that your staff, your most knowledgeable staff has, not on the everyday, administrative headache stuff, but on real strategic operations and making informed decisions that come from, not from technology, but from experience that technology is able to activate, right, and optimize. So I think, you'd asked what's the most surprising thing. And there were some things, and, if you double click down, but the least surprising thing, I think, is that because of this talent gap, which is not just in global trade, I think in many areas, companies are struggling with this. CEOs are seeing this as a big issue, not just in global trade, but in many areas, that they're turning to technology. That would not be surprising. Because with increased pressure to cut the bottom line, to increase the bottom line, to cut the costs, to increase the efficiencies, you're going to need to turn to technology. Whether that's AI, you talked about AI with global classification, and other areas as well, as that starts to emerge. To just simply automating and optimizing your import and your export functionality. So,
I think you hit on a key term, though, is optimizing your current staff. Because here's one thing, I think that it's a fallacy if somebody thinks they're going to be able to engage certain software and completely eliminate, employees, whether it's through attrition or you lay them off or whatever, to handle a certain function. I think the issue there is optimizing where you may not have to add more staffing to keep up with your volumes by enhancing and empowering your staff with that software that can handle some of the simplistic things. As it goes through, then it raises the issue of being able to apply your expertise in areas it needs it, and the simplistic things are handled automatically. So, that right there, I think, is going to be a huge issue, a positive one, if people are engaging in software. But the global trade management systems, or GTM, that's another area of this report that I found really, engaging or whatever, is that it talks about priority areas for technology investment. So in other words, in a GTM is like, where are people looking at? And I found it fascinating. The top issue there is supply chain security and data protection. It's like, medium to high, you're looking at 96% of focus on supply chain security and data protection. I mean, the cybersecurity issues are huge. I mean, we just had at the recording of this, just the previous day, 3 cell phone networks wound up getting, were down. Now, nobody said what the reason is behind it, but then simultaneous to that, you have the pharmaceutical industry that was a victim of a cyber attack. And so those kinds of things is going through is it comes back to what can you do in protecting your own things. So that was interesting in your report of, the investment in GTM, and the number one thing seems to be more cybersecurity or supply chain security.
Yeah, I mean, these stories are in the news, and there's more of them every week, every day, right? And so it's very front of mind that when you have incidents like this, and especially in an age of social media and very quick mobilization of the narrative, these sorts of things can do damage beyond just what is the delay, what is the fine. You're talking about reputational damage that can take a long time to recover from, and you're talking about, it can even be something where a story like that makes it harder for you to recruit people, and it exacerbates that existing, that existing other issue and pain point that we've talked about, which is the talent gap, right? So suddenly it's even harder to do that. It creates so many different problems that it does need to be a focus. And, we're hearing from people whose careers have been long and have lasted through the Mod Act and have lasted through, 9/11 and the shift over to the Department of Homeland Security and all that went with that, saying that right now is the most challenging time because there are so many things to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, I think to add to Andrew's comments, which were great, right on the, hit the nail on the head with that. But I think on the security, supply chain security, data privacy protection piece, the other thing that I think is raising that up is, one, there's some new laws coming out in other countries, like in China and in the EU where they're expanding on their data privacy laws. So, there's attention to that to make sure you're compliant with as they continue to build those out. But companies are also having, as they use technology, they are storing more and more sensitive, detailed data within these systems in order to comply. A good example would be if you're doing due diligence for third-party risk management on your suppliers to the nth tier, and you're gathering data related to compliance or ESG or forced labor related issues, you're gathering a lot of very sensitive data. And that data and that volume of data is a lot greater than it was 10 years ago. And the need to protect that data from a security standpoint, reputational standpoint, IPR standpoint is becoming a bigger issue. And I think that also leads into that. Why is this so high on the list of priorities? When we look at technology, it's not just the technology that I need to be more efficient. It's got to make me more efficient, but it better be secure. It's got to be secure.
Well, not only secure, but backed up. That's the other thing is that, and I will say, especially large companies and all that, there's always this idea of, we'll archive the data and all that. Great. But test that out. So go and see if you can find some specific data as what you were just talking about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever, maybe even 4 years ago, and test your archive. It's like, we're archived, we're backed up, we're great. Well, it's like taking all the data, and I've seen this so often, it's almost like it's dumped in a great big bucket, and then you're supposed to pull out your information. If you can't extract out meaningful data, your backup doesn't do you jack. It's you've got to be able to, not only put the data in and secure it, but extract that back out.
And I guess with the data and everything that you all are showing on the report, one of the things that I was, that, you know, as you all are talking about this, is sometimes, and you're not going to have a choice. I mean, like Karen, you said about like your supply chain. I mean, how to the nth tier, you said. I mean, yeah, you're storing that information, but with all the new requirements, for example, with forced labor, that's very obvious and very easy to talk about. How in the world are you, without automation, how are you going to even come close to knowing who your suppliers are? You know what I mean? Even down to, you know, when that was mined, you know, or harvested, you know, because unfortunately that's how deep customs is going if they're going to test your product, you know, and there's new technology that can test the, let's call it DNA of that product, you know, the where was that cotton really picked in the Uyghur region, you know, and you don't know. All you know is I have a shirt, you know, that's all I know, that I brought in a shirt, you know. So but based on that, and because of all that y'all are talking about, is there any data or any information that you all see that are trending that are going to shape the future of trade? I mean, like what you might see, like what may you see in the report next year? You know what I mean? Like in the 2024 report, what do you feel? I mean, I know it's like trying to look at a crystal ball, but I mean, is there anything, any indicators there that might be pointing towards we may need to be doing this versus that now? Or I don't know if there's anything on there that you might be able to comment on.
Oh, Andrew, you want to take a crack at that? I mean,
Oh, yeah, I'll peer into my crystal ball. And we can circle back in a year and we can laugh at how wrong I got it. But I would expect to see a lot of these trends continue. But what I would really expect to see, and we've already started to see signs of this, is a growing, if not level of comfort, understanding that artificial intelligence is going to become a necessary component of the solutions to these things. Because while AI has its limitations and we should be cognizant of them, the ability to sort through large amounts of data and to identify the signal in the noise is a strength, and it's one that I think, you know, if we were talking 10 years ago, and we were talking 10 years ago about, you know, artificial intelligence or things that were being called artificial intelligence applied to, you know, trade compliance, and there was a lot of skepticism then that I think we're seeing less of now. And I think we're going to see even less of it in future years as we start to test that. Karen, do you see anything else in the crystal ball?
you know, that's the top of mind. What came to me is exactly what you just said. Is I think AI is going to be key in these discussions, especially with regards to talent and technology in next year's report. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how it evolves, not only from its use, like where does it fit? Where is it being useful in the global trade space? You know, where is it deemed acceptable? And by acceptable, where is it being considered reasonable care by standards of agencies who you're having to comply with their regulations? Will customs in the US, for example, deem the use of classifying goods using AI as reasonable care when looking at complying with proper classification of your goods for the purposes of import? But also, there's a lot we don't know yet with regards to the regulatory side of AI. The EU has the AI Act, which is going to be coming into force. The US has the executive order that is going to ultimately generate legislation and regulations surrounding AI. You're seeing this in other countries as well. Regulations are out there that are being formulated, and AI is going to have to comply with those regulations. But right now, nobody knows what they are. So people are developing using AI based on, very vague parameters when it comes to a regulatory compliance environment. And I think we're going to see those regulations start to move forward in the coming year. And it'll be interesting to see how work being done in the AI space with global trade management, as well as other technology solutions, whether that changes the direction they're going or where they focus their efforts. I think that's going to be very interesting to watch.
Well, I will say that as we were looking at this report, I guess it was as I'm going to give you an assessment of how this report could be used by different facets of people in a company. So at your executive level, to me, this would be one of those where you should be able, and I'm talking literally, not only CEO, COO, CFO type things, then you get into the legal or compliance as well. But looking at this so that you can see some of the variables you need to be aware of that not only is your subordinate staff probably dealing with from a supply chain perspective, but also in looking at it from your overall vision and for your company and what you're doing, that these are variables you need to take into account that as you're dealing with it. The IT side of things in any of system development and integration of different software, third-party self-development type or self-developed software and all of that. Look at this from a standpoint of, are you covering all the different aspects that in this survey points out you should be looking at? Everything from better visibility into your supply chain to compliance to different things and all that. Your regulatory affairs type stuff to look at it, as you just said, the AI, artificial intelligence is one aspect that rules, regulations, and legislation are coming out of it. But then there's also the environmental and social governance and all that's coming into play from rules and regulations that are coming out of that, of getting your company through direct involvement or through trade associations to help define those rules and regulations. This report will help kind of zero in on that. But the point being is you can't go in and say, well, we need to do something on AI. Well, narrow the focus. AI and the rules and regulations specific to supply chain or specific to manufacturing or vetting people. Same thing with the social and or the environmental. And then the operational side of things, what you're dealing with your compliance, whether it's a hands-on compliance group or an advisor to operations. This particular report seems to show there's some key areas that if you're an HR, also looking at trying to fill positions, what are seems to be some of the key factors, not only in trying to recruit people, but also training and developing them and those kinds of aspects. That's just scratching the surface of what I'm saying. Do you agree with that? And do you have anything else to add?
I would agree with you, Andy. I would add to it that additionally, another segment of people that'll get benefit out of this report are service providers to these global trade management importer and exporter companies, corporations. These are your clients. These are the people that you're providing services to. And this report is going to give you insight as to what their priorities are, what their pain points are, where they're looking to spend their resources and their time and their efforts, what they're putting toward their global trade strategy in the coming year. And that tells you where you need to be positioning your services. You know, if you have services that are going to be hitting on these high points as far as where they're focusing their energies, regulatory initiatives, hiring, any of these areas, or where they might be outsourcing because they don't have the staff. This is insight to see where you may be able to provide them a benefit.
Well, I definitely look at this as kind of like that shiny penny, excuse me, if I can say it, that shiny penny to keep in your pocket is this report is definitely worth its value in trying to hit several different areas, but it's one of those that may not seem like a whole lot, but when you get into it, boy, it's rich in content.
Couldn't have said better myself.
Anything else that you would love to see? It's like, what would be, after reading this, what would you like to see, Andrew, or suggest maybe some of the action that somebody should take if they're in any kind of leadership role?
I think the first thing that they should think about doing is either in-house, or if it makes more sense with a consultant of some kind, create an impact report based on where that positioning is, and just to generate an understanding internally with main stakeholders, what's coming, how it might impact, who it might impact, what areas, and why does it matter. And as much as you can get it into dollars and cents, the better. I'll also say that somewhat self-aggrandizing, but it wouldn't hurt to reach out to software providers, right, and have a conversation about what solutions are out there, what is the needs assessment, and what would the ROI be, and what can be done to help meet those needs.
Excellent. I love that. And let me say that if you're going to look at doing an impact report, and do an assessment that way, that report doesn't necessarily, you don't have to have all the answers. The question is are there any vulnerabilities that need to be further investigated, and all that. So and again, this report would generate a lot of areas let me look over this way or whatever. Karen, how about from your perspective, any actions you recommend?
I would second what Andrew said. I think it's a tool to help you look at your corporate strategy, where you need to put your resources, where you may need to do further research before taking any steps. And clearly, in my mind, the technology is going to be key on any of these issues going forward. And having good communication with technology providers out there to learn what they can offer, where they can help, and those pain points that your company has is going to be really important going forward. The timeline to move through evaluating, acquiring, and implementing technology is not an instant thing. So the sooner you're having those discussions, ongoing discussions, because things change and enhance every year with software and technology solutions, but you want to keep those dialogues active because it's becoming more important every year as far as a tool.
I agree with it. Well, I will say there are a lot of companies, especially large ones, that will have a supply chain council or a transportation or import export type council group. And this report would be definitely something that should be distributed amongst all the members so that you can have a good discussion on that. And it ought to be put on your agenda, folks, if you've got such a thing, to literally talk about it. I think it's worthwhile. So it doesn't mean it's going to come up with a lot of answers. The key is that this report is going to spark or stimulate some good discussion. And you will, as a group, decide, we're okay in these different areas, but it'll also identify areas that maybe you need further research and investigation into a particular link of your supply chain. So, Linda, Andrew, I will say this has been a great discussion, and I love the report. Again, Thomson Reuters on your website. What is the website that they can get to this on?
The URL is a little bit complicated. I think if you were to type in Thomson Reuters global trade report, the SEO is good, so you'll be able to find it that way.
Well, and Lalo's going to correct me here. He's like, we're going to put a link to where you on our show notes so you can get to it. Cause I'm like, remember my memory's as long as a turtle's tail and just as fast. And he said it earlier and I've forgot about it. So we'll get back to it. So my apologies. Folks, I really appreciate y'all coming on board. Lalo and I have talked about this report a little bit, and we've enjoyed not only reading it, but having y'all on and talking about it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Sure, no problem.
Well, with that, folks, we hope you have a great day. Please like this, share this show, make comments on it, especially if you go to our YouTube channel. We need to expand our listenership. It is growing. You guys are doing fantastic, and we greatly appreciate that. But we need to continue on if we're going to sustain this show and move it forward. So with that, have a great day.
Yeah, and I keep on reminding people, Andy, that this content is free. So you can pay us back by liking or sharing. I mean, it just takes a little click. That's all it does. And obviously people may not think that goes a far way, but apparently Google and YouTube, they put a lot of weight in that once you start getting a lot of followers and likes and all that. So please do that and share it and help us grow this so that we can continue to keep this free content. So thank you all, like Andy said, and we'll be back with more episodes here. So thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.